Have you ever wondered why a piece of paper with your name and a set of numbers has more power than you yourself? We've been lied to our whole lives, told that a passport is an achievement of civilization, a document granting rights and freedoms. But what if I told you that everything is exactly the opposite? You have been deceived. Global historical science is hiding a monstrous truth from us about the origin of the passport system. It's not a ticket to a free world. It's an inventory number on a prisoner's leg. Ask yourself a simple question. Who and why in the 18th and 19th centuries suddenly needed to count every peasant, every vagrant, every living person with maniacal precision? Why exactly, during this period, as if on command, were strict restrictions on movement introduced in all so-called civilized countries? Official history mutters something incoherent about taxation and conscription. But let's use logic and look at the facts that lie on the surface, but which we stubbornly refuse to notice. Imagine a world before the beginning of the 19th century. Maps of that time were full of blank spots and strange names of states that are not in textbooks today. Borders were blurred, and suddenly, overnight, a total registration of human resources began. Precisely, resource. Because the passport system introduced in the Russian Empire, in Prussia, in France at that time, structurally resembled not state administration, but rather camp accounting. Historians tell us that the population grew naturally. But if we look at the dry figures of censuses and revision lists, we will see mathematical anomalies that cannot be explained by birth rates. The population did not grow, it appeared. It emerged from nowhere in entire layers, and these new people urgently needed to be tied to the land. Look at the decrees of Peter the Great and subsequent rulers. The introduction of the passport system in 1724 is presented to us as a measure to combat runaway peasants. But where were they running to? And, most importantly, where did they come from, in such numbers that capturing them required creating a gigantic bureaucratic machine? In an era when there were no computers, when paper was expensive, and literate people were, according to the official version, negligibly few, the state deployed a surveillance system that modern special services would envy. To issue, verify, and account for millions of paper passes, an army of officials was needed. Where were they trained? Who created this logistics? This is technically impossible for an agrarian society with a splinter and a quill pen. Unless that society was regaining control over territory after something terrible. A passport was not a right to leave. A passport was a prohibition against leaving. It was a tag tying a biological unit to a specific location. Passportless was a terrible stigma of the 19th century. A person without a paper was equated with a criminal. Why? Because free movement allowed people to see what they were not supposed to see. Imagine you live in a world that has just survived a catastrophe. Ruins are covered with clay and soil, old technologies lie underfoot, and new rulers of life are trying to gather the survivors and make them clear the debris. You don't need witnesses who will go to the neighboring province and tell that there are empty ghost towns standing intact, but without people. You need everyone to stay in their village and think that the world has always been so wretched and primitive. The passport system is a tool of quarantine. Recall the term Pale of Settlement. We are told that this only concerned certain ethnic groups. But if we dig deeper, we will see that the Pale of Settlement existed for all social classes, just in different forms. A peasant could not go farther than about 20 miles from his village without a special leave permit. It's a prison without walls. And this prison was built synchronously all over the world. Do you really believe that different countries, supposedly hostile to each other, simultaneously came up with identical methods of branding people? Or was there one central control? Let's look at the so-called residence permits. The name itself screams about the meaning of the document. You are granted a permit for life. You are allowed to live. Without this paper, you are biomass, subject to disposal or hard labor. In the 19th century, vagrancy laws were draconian. Anyone who could not confirm their attachment to a place was sent to hard labor. And here the question arises, what kind of work was it? Building forts? Digging canals? Or excavating the first floors of buildings that, according to the official version, were built that way, with windows in the ground? Passportless vagrants were free labor for concealing traces of a previous civilization. We are told about the demographic explosion of the 19th century, but any biologist will tell you that for explosive population growth, ideal conditions are needed: an abundance of food, medicine, and the absence of wars. And the 19th century was an era of endless wars, cholera epidemics, and famine. So where did the people come from? Why do statistics show a sharp jump in population precisely when passports were introduced? The answer is frighteningly simple. It was not natural growth. It was legalization. Authorities began issuing documents to those who emerged from the forests, descended from the mountains, or were unfrozen, metaphorically or literally, after a global cataclysm. The passport became an act of registering the survivors. Notice how these documents looked. A verbal description of appearance. Average height, blue eyes, straight nose. No photographs, no fingerprints at the beginning. It would seem that such a system is unreliable. Anyone could claim a false name. But the system worked. Why? Because fear was primal. People were not afraid of the police. They were afraid of being outside the system of ration distribution. A passport was a food card. In the post-apocalyptic conditions that the 18th and 19th centuries truly were, belonging to a community, to the world, guaranteed survival. World, in the sense of community, was not just a social structure. It was a lifeboat. And the passport was a ticket to that lifeboat. Those who remained overboard disappeared without a trace. We are used to thinking that serfdom is an ancient tradition, but the facts suggest otherwise. Harsh enslavement, that is, attachment to the land with documented registration, reached its peak precisely when, it would seem, the Age of Enlightenment arrived. What enlightenment, when millions of people are turned into inventory? This is not the evolution of society. This is the introduction of a state of emergency across the entire planet. Someone very powerful took control of the chaos and began to impose their order. And the first point of this order was a census of all living beings. Every soul had to be accounted for, taxed, and, most importantly, deprived of memory of the past. A passport, which indicated your social class, place of birth, and religion, erased your true ancestry. You became what was written on the paper, not who your ancestors were. Analyzing archives, we come across strange terms. Those who do not remember their kinship. In the 19th century, there were hundreds of thousands of such people. Official history says they were hiding from justice. Hundreds of thousands of criminals? Seriously? Or perhaps these were people who truly did not remember. People whose memory was erased by the shock of a catastrophe or some other impact. And the passport system was a way to give them a new, fabricated biography. Ivan, who doesn't remember his kinship, received a surname, an attachment to a village, and became a new man. An ideal slave who has no past but only the obligation to pay taxes and not leave the territory. This is only the tip of the iceberg. If we look at how passports changed, how requirements tightened, how visas were introduced, we will understand that the screws were tightened gradually, but relentlessly. We live in a reality constructed for us 200 years ago, and the key to this cage became an ordinary paper passport. But the most terrifying discovery awaits us. Look closely at old photographs from the mid-19th century. It doesn't matter what they depict. Washington, St. Petersburg, Paris, or Melbourne. Do you notice that eerie, resonating emptiness? Huge avenues, designed for millions of people, stand completely deserted. Gigantic palaces with doors 16 feet high, whose handles are at the level of a modern person's head. And amidst this imperial grandeur, rare figures of people in dirty rags, trudging knee-deep in mud next to carts pulled by thin horses. Historians will tell you it's a long exposure of the camera, people simply blurred. But why then are the horses, trees, and shadows clear? Why did millions of residents blur while a lone street sweeper remained? The answer is simple and terrible. There was no one to populate the cities. The population was annihilated or dispersed. And here the passport system enters the scene as the main instrument of the Great Settlement. Let's draw a parallel that will make you shudder. 1861. Serfdom is abolished in Russia. In the US, at almost the same time, the Civil War is taking place, ending with the abolition of slavery. In London, the first subway is launched, which allegedly was dug with shovels in a couple of years. Do you believe in such coincidences? In different hemispheres, separated by oceans and political systems, the liberation of huge masses of people occurs simultaneously. The official version states, "Humanism triumphed." An alternative analysis screams, "It was a planned operation to relocate labor resources." Freedom was a fiction. Freed peasants in Russia and former slaves in America were not given liberty. They were given documents. They were transferred from the status of private property to the status of state property. Empires urgently needed laborers to dig up buried cities. Have you ever wondered why America passed the Homestead Act, giving away land in the West for free, while in Russia, Stolypin later sent trains of settlers to Siberia? We are told it was about developing virgin lands. But look at maps of Tartary drawn before the 19th century. Siberia and the Wild West were densely populated with huge cities. Where did they go? Why did settlers arrive not in an empty field, but often settled on strange, geometrically regular hills where brickwork protruded from under the ground? A settler's passport was an order to inhabit ruins. The authorities needed to disperse the concentrated biomass of survivors from the disaster epicenters and spread them evenly across the map to secure the surviving infrastructure of an ancient civilization. Consider the absurdity of official logistics. How could the movement of millions of people be controlled without computers, without instant communication, having only a quill pen and paper? Imagine an office of that time, mountains of folders, dusty archives. To verify the identity of a person traveling from Voronezh to Moscow or from Boston to San Francisco would have required months of correspondence. But the system worked instantly. A police officer looked at the paper and knew, this person has the right to be here, and this one does not. This is possible only in one case, if the lists were compiled in advance and there were exponentially fewer people than textbooks portray. We are descendants of small groups of survivors, artificially multiplied and forcibly resettled, each given an inventory number. Notice the architectural dissonance. Buildings with ancient columns, intricate stucco, eternal granite embankments, and the primitive technologies of the new masters. The passport system cemented this divide. People were forbidden to settle in certain quarters, to enter certain buildings. Why did many palaces stand closed for decades? Why were services in huge cathedrals, capable of holding thousands, held in small chapels? Because the new owners of the world, with their passports, simply did not know how to operate these gigantic machines of the past. They were like savages who settled in an abandoned spaceport. The passport gave the right to live in a barracks next to a palace, but not in the palace. And the most terrifying evidence is the cemeteries. Walk through the old cemeteries of any major city in Europe or America. Look at the dates. You will find a mass of gravestones from the late 19th century. But where are the graves from the 17th, 16th centuries? Where are the millions of people who lived there before? They are gone. A layer of history has been cut away. The 19th century passport system is the starting point of a new era, an era of foundlings. All over the world, in the mid-19th century, giant orphanages opened. In Moscow, in New York, in London, thousands, tens of thousands of children without parents. Where did such an influx of orphans come from? The official version is silent or mumbles about poverty. But we understand. These are the children of those who did not survive the cataclysm, and these children were given new birth certificates, new surnames, new passports. Their memory of their parents was erased so that they wouldn't remember the world that existed before the mud. Look at fire statistics. Chicago, Moscow, cities in Europe, all of them burned in the mid-19th century. Terrible fires that supposedly destroyed wooden cities. But after the fire, as if by magic, blocks of red brick and stone grew on the ashes. In 2 or 3 years. This is impossible even with modern technology. The conclusion is obvious. The fires were a cover-up. They were needed to legalize the already existing stone buildings that were dug up and cleaned. And people with brand new passports were settled there, told, "We built this for you. Be grateful and pay taxes." The passport became a non-disclosure agreement. By accepting the document, a person agreed with the official version of reality. We look at our documents and see the place of birth field. But for a 19th century person, this was not just a geographical point. It was an attachment to a new matrix. If you were born in a place that officially does not exist, and how many cities disappeared from maps, you were assigned the nearest authorized settlement. This is how geography was rewritten. This is how the illusion was created that civilization developed linearly. But the passport offices of the 19th century worked not as registrars, but as generators of reality. They created a population on paper, and then fitted living people to these figures. And if you think something has changed today, remember how often passport forms change, biometrics and chips are introduced. The system continues to perfect control over those who survived. But what exactly are they trying to hide under layers of numbers and barcodes this time? Hold on tight, because now we are moving to facts that will turn your mind upside down. Let's talk about the logistics of life in the 19th century, as historians describe it to us, and why, without a strict passport system, this house of cards of lies would have collapsed instantly. We are told that in megacities, London, Paris, New York, St. Petersburg, in the mid-19th century, huge masses of people lived. But let's use a calculator. Official history claims that the main mode of transport was the horse. One horse produces from 20 to 30 pounds of manure and liters of urine per day. In a city with 1 million people, hundreds of thousands of horses would be required to ensure logistics, delivery of food, firewood, and water. That's thousands of tons of biological waste daily. The streets should have been covered with it up to the second floors. But in old photographs, we see perfectly clean avenues. Where did the manure go? Who cleaned it up? Where was it taken? No army of street sweepers with shovels could physically cope with such a volume. This is the first impossible detail. Either the cities did not exist in such a form, or the technologies were different, fuel-free, and the horses in the photos are already a post-apocalyptic cargo cult, where survivors tried to imitate gods. And here the passport becomes a key element of the conspiracy. The accounting system was needed not to manage the chaos of horse-drawn transport, but to conceal the fact that the cities were empty stage sets. The authorities settled people selectively, block by block, creating an illusion of life. The passport tied the new person to a specific street, so that they wouldn't go to the neighboring district and see that it was dead silence there and working eternal mechanisms that hadn't yet been broken or disconnected. Look at the architecture of that time. This is, perhaps, the loudest witness for the prosecution. We live in houses not built for us. Have you ever tried to heat a room with ceilings 15 or 16 feet high with firewood? Ordinary firewood in a Dutch oven? The laws of thermodynamics are relentless. Warm air rises. To heat such a volume of air in winter St. Petersburg or Chicago, forests would have to be burned on an industrial scale. Around the cities, there should have been deserts for hundreds of miles. But in old daguerreotypes, we often see avenues of ancient trees right within the city limits. This means the forest was not cut down. This means these buildings were not heated with firewood. The passport system was introduced precisely when old technologies of atmospheric electricity and centralized heat, traces of which we see in the form of strange fireplaces without chimneys and metal grates in the floors, were disconnected. People, like cattle, were driven into cold stone bags, forced to chop firewood, and given documents that stipulated their right to survival. We are hermit crabs that have moved into the shells of deceased giant mollusks. And so that we wouldn't ask questions like, whose shell is this? They invented a history, a religion, and gave us a passport. Now for the most terrifying part, the demographic miracle. 19th century statistics are riddled with anomalies. Suddenly, out of nowhere, hundreds of foundling hospitals appear all over the world. These are giant child-rearing facilities. We are told, parents gave their children away due to poverty. Do you believe this? The maternal instinct is one of the strongest in nature. For millions of children to be surrendered to orphanages en masse, something extraordinary must have happened. Or there simply were no parents? There's a theory that makes your blood run cold. Humanity was artificially restored. Babies in a cabbage patch is not just a fairy tale. It's a distorted memory of how new people were found or extracted from some incubators. And it was to these children, without family or tribe, that the state issued passports. An empty parents field, a fictitious surname, often based on the month, church, or craft, Pokrovsky, Oktyabrski, Kuznetsov. The passport became the only proof of a person's existence. Without it, you were a phantom. The foundling hospital system was an assembly line for producing loyal servants who didn't remember their origins for the new elite. These people didn't ask questions about the past because they had none. Their past began with the date their birth certificate was issued. Look at the global unification. Buildings in Australia, South Africa, Europe, and America are built according to the same blueprints. The same antique style, the same stone processing technologies that we cannot replicate today. This suggests that before the introduction of passports, the world was unified. There were no borders, no visas, no nations in the modern sense. There was a global civilization. The passport system fragmented this unified world into enclosures. You are French, you are German, you are Russian. You were forced to hate those who lived beyond the fence, even though just yesterday you were one people. Divide and conquer. The passport became an instrument of separation. The introduction of nationalities into documents is a brilliant move by the puppet masters. It forced the survivors to kill each other over imagined ideas instead of uniting against those who seized power. And now remember the cultural layer. We are told that 2 to 3 yards of soil accumulate over a couple of centuries. Dust, dirt, debris. But why then does ancient Rome stand at the same level as it does now, while 19th century buildings in Kazan or Omsk are buried up to the windows of their first floors in clay? Clay doesn't just fall from the sky. These are traces of a flood, a mudslide, a giant wave. And the passport system is a register of cleanup crews. People were assigned to cities to excavate these ruins. We call them basements. But look closely. These basements have full-fledged windows and doors leading into the ground. We live in the cemetery of a previous civilization, and our passports are work permits in this giant burial ground. But there's another fact that official science cannot explain. The disappearance of star forts. Thousands of star-shaped objects across the planet. In the early 19th century, they were still on maps. By the end of the century, they were erased or rebuilt. It was the introduction of strict control over population movement that allowed these energy sources, for that is what they were, not fortifications, to be quietly dismantled or repurposed. A cordoned-off zone, no entry, show your papers. Do you begin to understand? Passports were introduced not for them to know who you are, but for you not to know where you really are. Has it never bothered you that the 19th century was an era of total uniforms? Look at portraits and casual photos from that time. Gymnasium students, university students, engineers, postmen, foresters, railway workers. Everyone, absolutely everyone, wore uniforms with lapel insignia, caps with cockades, and badges of distinction. We are told it was just fashion. But fashion is not that strict, pervasive, and mandatory. This is a sign of martial law. The passport system and the general unification of appearance are links in the same chain. Humanity after the catastrophe was not just counted, it was mobilized. We look at the past through the rose-tinted glasses of romantic novels, but the reality was like a strict correctional facility. There were practically no civilians. Everyone was assigned to departments. Everyone served the system. A passport was not an identification document of a free citizen, but the personal file of a soldier in a labor army, deployed to restore infrastructure after the Great Reset. At this moment, the most grandiose and cynical substitution of concepts in human history occurs. A living person, a creation of nature, is replaced by a legal fiction, a physical person, a paper duplicate. When you are issued a passport, or a birth certificate, which is its precursor, the state effectively creates your dead copy, a persona. This copy belongs to the system. And it is this copy that is burdened with debts, taxes, and obligations. You, as a living person of flesh and blood, may consider yourself free, but your passport avatar is the property of the crown, republic, or empire. This legal magic was invented and perfected precisely in the mid-19th century. Napoleon's Code, Speransky's reforms, and their counterparts around the world are not about human rights. They are about inventorying state property, and you became the property. Why should this provoke your rage, not just curiosity? Because we were deprived not only of freedom of movement, we were deprived of potential and time. There is a hypothesis that before the implementation of passport control and the change in dietary paradigm, imposing potatoes, yeast bread, and sugar, human biological resources were different. Look at biblical patriarchs or kings from Sumerian lists. Lifespans there are measured in centuries. Fairy tales? What if not? What if the passport system introduced an expiration date? The fixation of a birth date became a tool for programming decay. You are told, you are 60, you are old, and you believe it, and your body executes the command of society. But in archives from as early as the 18th century, strange records are found of people who lived for 150, 200 years. They were called elders. Where did they disappear? They were optimized. The system doesn't need long livers who remember the truth about the old world. It needs short-lived worker ants, generations changing so quickly that knowledge simply doesn't have time to pass from grandparents to grandchildren. Passports became the walls of a new prison for nations. They divided us with linguistic and national barriers. Before the 19th century, it seems, the world was much more homogeneous. There was a unified language of images or communication that allowed identical antique buildings to be constructed from St. Petersburg to Washington. The introduction of national passports was accompanied by the artificial creation and imposition of new literary languages. Grammars were written in the offices of scholars, invented by enlighteners. People were taught not to understand their neighbors. Me no understand you is the result of artificial segregation. The passport documented this division. You became strangers on your own planet. You were led to believe that enemies lived across the river, although genetically and culturally, you were one. This is a planetary scale betrayal. We have been locked in cages of national states, with keys handed to wardens whom we now call governments. And the most outrageous part is that we continue to support this lie every day. We are proud of our passports, our citizenships, not understanding that we are proud of our inventory number in a global concentration camp. We pay fees to be allowed to exist. Think for a second. You pay a land tax on the land your house stands on. To whom? To the land? No. You pay the system for the rent of a piece of the planet that by birthright belongs to every living being. A passport is a sublease agreement that you didn't sign, but under which you are obligated to pay your entire life. It is bondage, skillfully disguised as a privilege. In the 19th century, when this noose was just tightening, people still resisted. There were cholera riots, which were actually riots against accounting and forced medicine. There were uprisings of the passportless. They were brutally suppressed. We were broken. We were taught to present documents on demand to anyone in uniform, trembling with fear that the paper might be expired. What are they hiding behind 7 seals in those closed Vatican archives and special library depositories? Why is access to complete birth registers and true revision lists so difficult or intentionally convoluted for ordinary people? Because if we compile a complete family tree, we will see monstrous gaps. We will see that our genealogies massively break off or begin with foundlings, orphans, and settlers of the mid-19th century. We will realize that we are a civilization of orphans, occupying someone else's incredibly advanced home. And this home is full of wonders that we use like savages cracking nuts with a microscope. The anger you might be feeling now is normal. It is the awakening of genetic memory. You feel that you have been robbed. Not just history has been stolen from you. Your greatness and belonging to something greater than a tax resident have been stolen. You have been reduced to the size of a laminated page with a stamp. But the most terrifying thing is not in the past. The most terrifying thing is that this experiment is not over. The scenario is repeating with frightening accuracy, but on a new technological level. The same methods, the same goals. History teaches nothing only to those who do not know it. And now we know. Or at least we are beginning to wake up from this age-old hypnosis.